Out on the long, empty highways of America, truckers often become a part of the dark and unspoken history of the roads. Joe Langley had been a long-haul trucker for nearly 20 years, accustomed to sleepless nights, eerie rest stops, and endless miles of asphalt. Nothing fazed him anymore. That was, until he picked up a load heading through Nevada's desert at night, an area notorious among truckers for strange happenings. The night he left the depot, a dense fog rolled in, unusual for the desert. His CB radio crackled occasionally, but no one seemed to be on the other end. The road ahead was a straight shot through miles of nothingness, with only the low hum of his rig keeping him company. He always kept his truck radio off during these late-night runs. The silence, he found, was better than the weird static and faint voices that sometimes seeped through. Hours passed, and as Joe checked his watch, he realized he should have reached the next truck stop by now. The roads here were unfamiliar, but he knew the route well enough to feel something was off. He tried the GPS, but the screen flickered and showed nothing but a black void. His CB radio buzzed again, this time with more urgency, and a voice, garbled, barely a whisper, said, "Don't stop." Joe's fingers gripped the wheel tighter, his pulse racing. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just some joker messing with him. But the fog thickened, and his headlights barely penetrated it. He slowed down, not wanting to end up in a ditch. As he did, something caught his eye, a figure standing just off the road. It was a woman, barely visible in the swirling mist. She was waving, her movements slow and deliberate. Instinct told him to keep driving, but something else, the loneliness, maybe the eeriness of the moment, made him pull to a stop. She approached the truck, moving with an unsettling calmness. As she came closer, her face became clearer, and Joe felt an immediate sense of dread. Her eyes were hollow, black pits. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she seemed to flicker in and out of the fog like an apparition. Joe slammed his foot on the gas, but the truck sputtered, refusing to move. The woman reached for the door, her fingers leaving smears of black ooze on the glass. She whispered something, though Joe couldn't make out the words. Heart pounding, he reached for the ignition, trying to turn the truck back on, but it was dead. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled again. "She's not real. Drive." His breath hitched. His heart was thundering in his chest, but he turned to face the voice. There was no one else in the truck. His mind raced, questioning if he was dreaming or if this was some nightmare born out of exhaustion. But the woman outside was still there, her hand now pressed against the window. Her head tilted unnaturally, and her mouth opened wide, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Joe screamed, slamming his fists against the steering wheel. The truck roared to life without warning, and his tires screeched as he sped off. In the rearview mirror, he saw her shape dissolve into the fog, her form disintegrating like ash in the wind. For the next few miles, Joe kept his foot heavy on the gas rack, but the radio remained eerily silent. The fog began to clear, and the familiar, desolate road stretched ahead of him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He convinced himself it was a hallucination, sleep deprivation playing tricks on his mind. He'd heard other truckers talk about strange things on these highways, but he always brushed it off. Until now. Joe finally spotted a dimly lit truck stop in the distance. He pulled in, desperate for a moment to catch his breath and regroup. The diner lights flickered as he walked inside. A few other truckers sat at the counter, heads low over their mugs of coffee. Joe sat down, still shaken, and ordered a coffee of his own. The waitress came over, her face tired and worn, like she'd seen it all before. "You okay, Hon?" she asked, her eyes narrowing at the sight of his pale face. "Yeah, just a long night," Joe muttered, staring into his cup. "You been driving through that stretch on Route 50, she asked, her voice low. Joe looked up, surprised. "How'd you know?" she sighed, leaning against the counter. "You wouldn't be the first to see her." Joe felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Her?" The waitress nodded slowly, glancing around the diner as if making sure no one else was listening. "They call her the Lady in the Fog. She's been around for years, haunting the roads. Most people who see her don't make it through the night." Joe swallowed hard, his hand trembling around the coffee cup. What does she want?" "No one knows," the waitress whispered, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Some say she's the ghost of a woman who died on that road, waiting for a ride that never came. Others think she's something older, something darker." Joe stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. He needed to get back on the road, away from whatever this place was. As he walked out to his truck, he glanced up at the sky, half expecting the fog to roll back in. But the night was clear, the stars shining down like tiny points of light in the vast desert sky. Climbing back into his truck, Joe shook off the lingering unease. He started the engine and pulled out of the truck stop, the road stretching endlessly before him. But as the night wore on, something gnawed at him, a feeling that he wasn't alone. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw it, the faint outline of a figure, barely visible in the dark. It was her, the lady in the fog. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures stood behind her, lining the road, their hollow eyes following his truck as he sped into the night. Joe's grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. He pressed the gas harder, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in. The CB radio crackled one last time before going silent for good. Don't stop. The long-haul trucker lifestyle breeds stories, ones that come from dark, desolate roads and lonely nights. Jimmy was a seasoned driver, accustomed to late-night hauls and strange sights on the highways, but nothing had ever truly scared him. He'd seen things out there, shadows in the distance, odd lights in the sky, but he always chalked it up to fatigue or his imagination. Until the night he was driving through the mountains of Colorado. It was past midnight when Jimmy's rig rumbled down a narrow stretch of road known to locals as Devil's Pass. The sharp twists and turns of the mountainous terrain were enough to keep him on edge, but the isolation of the road amplified his unease. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, and the radio was nothing but static. His headlights cut through the dense darkness, illuminating only the few feet ahead. The road was slick with rain, and the trees loomed like tall, ominous figures. As Jimmy rounded a sharp bend, something darted in front of his truck. His heart jumped, and he slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded on the wet pavement, but finally came to a stop. Breathing heavily, he peered out into the road, expecting to see a deer or some animal that had caused him to swerve, but there was nothing, just the empty, rain-soaked highway. He sat there for a moment, heart pounding, trying to steady his breathing. Just tired, he muttered to himself. He was about to hit the gas when he noticed something strange. There were no sounds, no rain pattering on the roof, no wind rustling the trees, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure was standing on the side of the road. It was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like tattered, old-fashioned clothing. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but Jimmy could tell it was staring directly at him. His skin prickled, and he felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. But something in his gut told him not to move. Not yet. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward the truck. Its movements were unnatural, almost as if it was gliding across the ground rather than walking. Jimmy's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wanted to look away, to slam on the gas and leave whatever this thing was behind, but he was frozen. Eyes locked on the figure. It moved closer, and as it did, the air in the cab grew colder, unnaturally cold. His breath fogged up in front of him. He could see more of it now. A man, or something that had once been a man. Its face was pale, gaunt, and its eyes were nothing but deep, hollow sockets. No pupils, no humanity, just darkness. The figure stopped at the edge of the truck's headlights, staring up at Jimmy through the windshield. Slowly, it lifted one hand and pointed toward the cab, its long, bony fingers trembling as it beckoned him. Jimmy's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he was paralyzed with fear. He tried to start the truck, but the engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered and dimmed, leaving the figure half hidden in shadow. The temperature inside the truck continued to drop, and a deep guttural voice echoed inside his head. "Get out!" The voice wasn't coming from the figure. It was inside his mind, crawling through his thoughts like a parasite. It wasn't a request, it was a command. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey, to step out of the truck and walk toward the figure waiting for him in the dark. But some primal survival instinct buried deep inside him, kept him glued to his seat. He shook his head violently, gripping the wheel harder, trying to fight the urge to open the door. Suddenly, the truck's CB radio crackled to life. Static at first, then a voice, urgent, panicked. "Do not get out of that truck. Do you hear me? Don't open the door." Jimmy's eyes widened. The voice wasn't familiar, but the tone was clear. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what he was facing. His pulse raced as he glanced at the CB, then back at the figure outside. It hadn't moved, but its hand was still raised, still beckoning him. The radio buzzed again. "It can't get you if you stay inside. Keep the door locked. It can't cross the threshold." Jimmy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt a surge of hope. The truck was his sanctuary, his only protection from whatever the hell that thing was. But the figure seemed to sense his defiance. Its head tilted, and for the first time it smiled. The grin spread across its face, wide and unnatural, stretching far too long for a human mouth. It looked hungry, malevolent. The figure dropped its hand and began to circle the truck, moving slowly, deliberately, like a predator sizing up its prey. As it moved, the truck groaned, metal creaking under an invisible weight. It wasn't touching the truck, but Jimmy felt it, felt the pressure building, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The radio buzzed again. "It's trying to force its way in. You have to stay strong. Whatever you do, don't open the door. Don't look at it." But Jimmy couldn't help himself. His eyes followed the figure as it moved to the passenger side of the truck. It stopped, leaning in close to the window, its face almost pressed against the glass. Its smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of cold, calculating malice. It raised one hand again, its fingers splayed across the window. The glass began to frost over under its touch. Then the handle of the passenger door clicked. Jimmy's heart dropped. He hadn't unlocked the door, but the handle was moving on its own, slowly turning as the figure outside tried to get in. He lunged across the cab, slamming his hand down on the lock, but the handle kept turning, as if the lock meant nothing. The door creaked open, just an inch, but that was all it needed. A thin, black mist seeped in through the crack, curling like smoke, filling the cab with the stench of rot and decay. The figure was trying to push its way inside. Jimmy scrambled back to his seat, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of his chest. The radio crackled one last time. "You're running out of time. Drive. Now." In a blind panic, Jimmy turned the key. The truck roared to life. Without thinking, he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched and the truck lurched forward, the door slamming shut as the vehicle barreled down the road. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, but in the rearview mirror, he could still see it, the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching him drive away. It didn't chase him. It didn't need to. Jimmy never drove that route again. He quit trucking not long after, but every now and then, in the dead of night, he swears he can still feel the cold creeping into his bones, hear the faint whisper of that voice calling him back to the mountains. Get out! There's a stretch of highway in the heart of the Midwest that truckers whisper about, Route 26, known for being deserted at night. It's a quiet, lonely road, one that cuts through miles of empty farmland and dense woods, with only the occasional dilapidated gas station or rusted-out diner to break up the monotony. Old-timers say it's cursed, and that strange things happen to those who drive it alone at night. Mitch Carter had heard the stories, but he wasn't the superstitious type. He'd been a trucker for over 15 years, and Route 26 was just another road to him. That is, until one fateful night during a heavy thunderstorm. It was around 2 a.m. when Mitch found himself on Route 26. The rain was coming down in sheets, his wipers barely keeping up as his headlights illuminated the slick asphalt ahead. The CB radio was quiet, the familiar static now oddly comforting against the storm raging outside. He hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, and the isolation was starting to get to him. The only sound was the rumble of his truck and the relentless patter of rain on the windshield. But then, as he rounded a bend in the road, his headlights caught something in the distance. A figure, standing in the middle of the highway. Mitch's foot slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the wet road. The truck shuddered to a halt just a few feet from the figure. A woman, drenched from the rain, wearing what looked like an old, tattered white dress. She was standing completely still, facing away from him, her head bowed. Her hair hung limply over her face, matted with water. For a long moment, Mitch just sat there, heart pounding, staring at her through the windshield. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge the truck that had nearly hit her. She just stood there, unmoving, like a statue. Mitch hesitated. He didn't want to get out of the truck, not in the middle of a storm, not with this strange woman standing in the road. But he couldn't just leave her there either. She might be hurt or lost. Reluctantly, he grabbed his flashlight, pulled on his rain jacket, and opened the door. The wind hit him immediately, howling and cold, the rain soaking him within seconds. He trudged toward the woman, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain. "Ma'am?" He called out, raising his voice over the storm. "You okay?" No response. Mitch stopped a few feet away from her, uneasy. There was something wrong about this. His instincts screamed at him to get back in the truck, but he ignored them. "Hey, you need help? Are you hurt?" Slowly, the woman began to turn. Mitch's breath caught in his throat. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like her joints didn't work properly. When she finally faced him, his heart stopped. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and sagging like she'd been dead for weeks. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't looking at him. They were hollow, empty sockets oozing black liquid that ran down her cheeks like tears. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her lips cracked and bleeding. Mitch stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Jesus Christ!" he gasped, his heart racing. He turned and bolted back to his truck, slipping on the wet pavement. He fumbled with the door handle, like finally wrenching it open and throwing himself inside. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. Come on, he growled, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. The truck sputtered, coughed, and then died. Mitch slammed his fist against the dash. The rain pounded harder, the wind rocking the cab. In the side mirror, he saw the woman. She was walking toward him, slowly, deliberately, her feet dragging through the mud, her dead eyes locked on him. Mitch's pulse raced. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal, just static on the line. He was trapped, alone on Route 26, with a walking corpse closing in on him. The woman reached the side of the truck. Her bony fingers scraped against the glass, leaving streaks of black ooze. She leaned forward, her hollow eyes peering through the window, her mouth still hanging open, as if she was trying to speak but couldn't. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. Mitch jumped, startled by the noise. A voice came through the static, faint but clear enough to send chills down his spine. "Don't look at her. She'll take you." Mitch froze, staring at the radio in disbelief. The voice was calm, authoritative, like it knew exactly what was happening. He glanced at the woman, still clawing at the window, her mouth opening wider now, revealing jagged, broken teeth. "Drive," the voice on the radio said, more urgently this time. "Now." The engine roared to life on its own. Mitch didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the mud before finding traction. The truck lurched forward, sending the woman tumbling into the ditch as it sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, he saw her crawl out of the mud, her limbs twisted and contorted, her hollow eyes still locked on him as she faded into the distance. Mitch kept driving, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't slow down, didn't dare look back again. The voice on the radio was gone, replaced by the familiar hum of static. The rain began to let up, and soon the road was clear again. But even after he made it off Route 26, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for the next trucker to stop, waiting for someone who wouldn't be as lucky as he was. For weeks afterward, Mitch avoided that stretch of highway. He couldn't forget the sight of her face, the hollow eyes, the black ooze, the way her fingers scraped at the glass, trying to get in. And every time he passed a lonely road or drove through the rain, he couldn't help but check his mirrors, half expecting to see her again. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't gone. She was still out there. Jake had always preferred driving through the night. It was quieter, calmer, and the roads were mostly empty, perfect for a trucker who liked his peace. He had a regular route through the Appalachian Mountains, a path he knew like the back of his hand. The road twisted and turned through dense forests, dark as ink during the late hours, with nothing but the glow of his headlights cutting through the gloom. On this particular night, a thick fog had rolled in, making visibility worse than usual. Jake wasn't too concerned, though. He'd driven through fog before, and he kept his focus on the winding road ahead. The only sound was the low hum of the truck engine and the occasional distant call of some nocturnal creature from the woods. About an hour into his drive, something odd happened. His radio, usually filled with the familiar static of an empty frequency, buzzed to life. It wasn't clear at first, just faint whispers mixed with static. Jake furrowed his brow and turned the volume down, thinking it was just some interference from the mountains. But then a voice broke through, clear but unnerving. "You need to stop." Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. The voice was low, almost a growl, and it wasn't coming from the CB channel he was tuned to. He checked the dials, but everything looked normal. The voice crackled again. "Pull over." Jake shook his head. "Hell no," he muttered under his breath, thinking it had to be a prank or some bizarre interference. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had no intention of stopping. Not out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, surrounded by fog. As if to confirm his decision, something darted across the road up ahead. He barely caught a glimpse of it, a shadow, low to the ground, moving unnaturally fast. He hit the brakes, but it was already gone, swallowed up by the fog. His heart raced as he scanned the road for any sign of what it could have been. A deer? Maybe? But it hadn't looked like any animal he'd ever seen. The radio crackled again. "Don't ignore me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The voice was angry now, more insistent. He shut off the radio completely, hoping the silence would calm his nerves, but it didn't help. Something felt off, like the air around him was thick with tension. His instincts told him to get through this stretch of road as fast as possible. A few miles later, the fog thickened even more, swirling around the truck like a living thing. The headlights barely cut through it, and he slowed down to avoid careening off the narrow, winding road. That's when he saw it, something standing by the side of the road. At first, it looked like a person, a woman, maybe. But as he got closer, his stomach churned with unease. She wasn't standing in any normal way. Her limbs were bent at odd angles, her back hunched. Her head was bowed, face hidden beneath a long curtain of stringy black hair. She wore a dirty, tattered dress that hung loosely from her twisted frame, swaying slightly in the breeze. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel. He slowed down even more, his eyes fixed on her as he passed by. She didn't move, didn't even twitch, just stood there, unnaturally still, as if waiting for something. His headlights washed over her for just a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. As the truck rolled by, he could feel her presence, like an icy hand brushing against the back of his neck. His stomach dropped. There was no way she should be out here, not in this weather, not dressed like that. And then, in the side mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The woman was no longer on the side of the road. She was running, no, crawling, on all fours, chasing the truck. Her limbs bent grotesquely, her body moving in unnatural jerks as she scuttled along the road behind him, her hair whipping in the wind. Her eyes glowed in the dark, two pale orbs locked onto his truck, like she was hunting him. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, his heart pounding in his chest. The truck roared forward, but the road was slick with fog and winding through dangerous curves. He couldn't go as fast as he wanted, but he had to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. He glanced in the mirror again. She was still there, and she was getting closer. Her movements were impossible, like she was some kind of twisted marionette, being yanked along by invisible strings. Her bones cracked audibly with each contorted step, but nothing slowed her down. Suddenly, the CB radio flicked on again, blaring loud, distorted static. Jake hadn't touched the switch. "Stop the truck!" the voice commanded, furious now, shaking the entire cab. "You can't escape her." Jake's heart was in his throat. He had no idea what to do. His instincts screamed at him to keep going, to not stop, no matter what. But the road was getting more treacherous, the curve sharper, the fog thicker. The woman, if that's what she even was nearly at the back of the truck, her twisted body clinging to the edge of the road. In a panic, Jake yanked the wheel hard, turning down an old dirt road that veered off into the woods. The truck skidded, bouncing over the uneven terrain as he pushed it to the limit, praying it would lose her in the darkness. He didn't dare look in the mirror now. He just focused on the narrow path ahead, the trees looming like dark specters on either side. For what felt like an eternity, he drove in silence, the sound of his truck the only noise piercing the night. The voice on the radio had stopped, and so had the woman, at least he hoped so. Finally, after a few more miles, the fog started to lift. The trees thinned, and Jake saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. A small town. Relief washed over him as he slowed the truck, his pulse still racing, his hands slick with sweat. He pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the only place open at this ungodly hour. His body trembled as he killed the engine and climbed out, his legs shaky beneath him. He glanced back down the road he'd come from, half expecting to see that twisted figure crawling out of the darkness, but there was nothing. Inside the diner, the warmth of the lights and the hum of conversation were a welcome change. He slid into a booth, barely noticing the other late-night patrons. A waitress came over, her tired eyes looking him up and down. "Rough night?" she asked. Jake nodded, still too shaken to speak. He ordered a coffee, just needing something, anything, to calm his nerves. As he sat there, trying to gather himself, an old man at the counter turned to him, his voice raspy with age. "Come from up the mountain, didn't you?" the old man asked, his eyes narrowing. Jake looked up, confused. "Yeah." "How'd you know?" "Yeah, how'd you know?" The old man chuckled darkly. "You saw her, didn't you? The woman on the road?" Jake's stomach lurched. "You know about her?" The man nodded slowly, his expression grim. "You're lucky you got away? Most folks who see her don't. She's been out there for years. A long time ago, some say she was a hitchhiker, left for dead in the fog. Others say she's something worse, something older. But once she's on your trail," he paused, eyes fixed on Jake's pale face, "she never stops hunting.